A little bit about journalism in Israel. To be a journalist here is a little bit like being a kid in a candy shop, because there is so much going on all the time. And when I first arrived here about 25 years ago, you had politics, you had war, you had the superpowers testing each other for influence. You had all military stuff, you had all this stuff going on. Then about 20 years ago, suddenly you had a whole other layer that was laid on top of that, which was Israel's extraordinary technological development that then blossomed into this entrepreneurial business phenomenon. And Israel suddenly became a superpower in terms of technology and entrepreneurship. And the atmosphere that you find walking down Rothschild Boulevard reminds me a lot of being in London in the 1970s, when you couldn't walk down the street without tripping over a punk rock band. And the kids that you would see playing guitar in the back room of the local pub one week would be on television and signing record deals and playing stadiums the next week. And here it's exactly the same, except this younger generation are not writing songs, they're writing code. They're not playing guitars, they're playing with computers. And the deals that they sign are not worth thousands of dollars, they're worth millions, if not billions of dollars. But the problem being a journalist covering those stories is that most of what they do is very, very boring. And there are very few rock stars among this new generation of bubbling talent. And so it takes a special kind of journalist, first of all, to tell those stories, and secondly, to spot the rock stars when they do arrive and realize that that's a story worth telling, and to tell it well. And that's what we're here to celebrate tonight. Because tonight, we're here for the launch of a book that is written by someone who knows how to write these stories, and who spotted a rock star and spotted the story and has done an amazing job in telling a terrific story. So please welcome the author of Titled, Brian Blum. I'm going to give this to you.
You're going to give this to me?
That's you. Because you're going to talk more than me, so your voice needs to hold out.
Can you hear Matthew if he talks without this?
I will talk like this, and you will hear me. So, first of all, Brian, why did you choose, of all things, to tell this story? I mean, writing a book is a little bit like choosing a partner, okay? Because you're going to live with this story for at least a year. You have to be kind of in love with everything that's going on. And what attracted you to this story?
A year. I worked on the book for 3.5 years, and we owned the Better Place car, which is part of the reason I wrote the book, for 4.5 years before we finally sold it earlier this year. So the reason that I got into this particular story is really because I fell in love with a car. I fell in love with a company, but I fell in love with this car. My wife and I, Jody, and our whole family went to the Better Place Visitor Center in Herzliya, which is where they were showing the cars to the public in the summer of 2012. And we got a tour, and we saw the movie, and we took a test drive. Everyone in the family did that. And when we were done, we were like, we have to get this car. We hadn't gone in planning to get the car. We went in because it just seemed like a fun thing to do. It was a summer, we had been to the beach, we'd been to the museums. What else were we going to do? So we'll take a test drive. We fell in love. Within 2 weeks, we had signed the paperwork, and we bought the car. And this is very unlike me, because as a journalist, I do an incredible amount of research about everything. If I'm going to buy a hard drive, I will spend 20 hours researching every possible hard drive on Amazon before I spend the $60 that it costs to buy the drive. If we're going to go on a vacation, I will spend God knows how many hours researching every location, every hotel, every restaurant, every attraction. So, and in the case of this car, we just fell in love and bought it. And when the company went out of business less than 9 months later, I said, wait a minute, did I do my due diligence? That's what you do in the investment world. You research and you figure out whether or not the company you're about to invest in is worth it. And it's like, I didn't do my due diligence. And I got to find out what happened. Why did this car fail? Why did this company fail? And so I started to research and I started to interview people, and it became more and more interesting. And 3.5 years later, here you all are, for the book launch.
So tell us first of all about this car. You describe it rather lovingly in the book. You take us through all its different high-tech on-screen displays, the stuff that talks to you and tells you not just GPS, but where to fill up and how much you got left and where to go and then how to charge it. What was so special about the car? Why did people love it so much?
So, an entrepreneur named Shai Agassi, who had been working for SAP, an Israeli entrepreneur, got the idea in about 2005, 2006 in Davos, Switzerland, where he was a member of the Forum of Young Global Leaders, which is a division of the World Economic Forum, and he was part of this group of select young leaders who were given a task to make the world, to figure out what they could do to make the world a better place. Some people tackled healthcare, some people tackled other topics, but he decided to tackle gasoline, pollution, emissions. Okay, I think I hopefully fixed that. And so he and a partner came up with the idea for what would be Better Place. And the idea was, how can we turn the world from gasoline, which pollutes, which has connections with countries which are not necessarily friendly to the West, how can we turn them to electric cars using the technology that existed at this point it was 2007. And at one point he said in a TED Talk, he said, there's no time for a science fair. There was no time to develop new battery technology. There was no time to develop anything more than what existed right then and there. How can we do it? The batteries won't last more than maximum 100, 120 kilometers. That's not going to work. People are not going to buy a car. They're not going to switch from gas for 120 miles before they have to plug in and charge. And where are you going to do that? And so he came up with the idea of creating electric cars with switchable batteries. So for those of you who don't know the car, you would charge at home, but if you ran out of juice before you got to the end of your battery at your 120 kilometers, you would pull into what looked kind of like a gasoline, kind of like a car wash, like a gas station car wash. You would go up on a ramp, you would turn the car into neutral, the car would be raised up a little bit on a platform, a robot would come in from the switching station, it would take out your spent battery, push it into the switching station, bring in a brand new recharge battery, put it back into the car, and in 5 minutes off you would go and you could drive another 120 kilometers. And that was a solution for driving and converting the world to electric cars in 2007. And in addition to that, there was all kinds of cool technology that told you, how many kilometers you had, where the nearest switching station is, where the nearest charge plug was. There was all kinds of wonderful things that allowed you to drive anywhere in Israel. You could go from the Golan Heights to Eilat entirely on switching batteries. And Shai Agassi did that once in August of 2012. He tweeted all the way from the Golan to Eilat. We did it once. We went actually Jody did it, went to the Hula Valley. I think it took her 3 or 4 switches to get there, each switch taking 5 minutes. You have to pull in. But she was happy to do that because she was helping make the world a better place. That's what the car did.
Okay, so that was the car. And who who is Shai Agassi? Who was he? Where did he come from? What kind of person is he? And in what way did the company that he founded reflect him and his personality?
As I said, Shai Agassi was an entrepreneur who had most previously worked at SAP. Before that, SAP is one of the largest enterprise software companies in the world. They're based in Germany. They had offices in Palo Alto, and he worked in their office in Palo Alto. Before that, he had programmed computers. He built other companies. He sold one of them to SAP. Before that, he raised more money, sold that one. So he was a very successful, very well-connected entrepreneur. He was brilliant. The best way to describe him, and I shouldn't say in the past tense because he's still alive and kicking, but the best way to describe him in his Better Place days was like the Israeli version of Steve Jobs. He could talk anyone into believing whatever he wanted you to believe. Just like Steve Jobs had what everyone was called a kind of a reality distortion field where he would believe something and no one else would believe it, and then he would eventually convince you that it was true, and then he would eventually get that product built. And that's why you have the Macintosh and the iPhone and the iPad and everything else. And Shai was like that. He could make things happen that didn't exist before. And to its credit, and I know Better Place doesn't exist today, and we'll get to that, that's why you're here, that's why the book is called The $1 Billion Crash of the Car That Took on Big Auto, Big Oil in the World. But when he built it, he built something that did not exist before, a car that could switch batteries, that could go anywhere, and it was an amazing accomplishment, and he was a true visionary.
So that's the car, that's the man. What was the company? What was Better Place? And why was there so much hype about it? After all they did was they sold you an electric car. Big deal. So they're like any other car distributor. What's the big deal about Better Place and the company?
So you have to remember the time in 2007, 2008, when the company was just getting started. There was this other little company called Tesla. And Tesla was smaller than Better Place, had raised less money, in fact had run out of money so dramatically that Elon Musk, its founder and CEO, had pumped in much of the money he'd earned from PayPal, which was where he earned his fortune, into Tesla. Eventually the company had to be bailed out from the United States. They raised, got a big bailout from the US government, which they paid back. But at that point, this other company, Better Place, was on its way to raising almost $1 billion. They raised $850 million in total. And they were on the cover of every magazine. Shai Agassi was named to Time Magazine's most influential people of the year in, I think it was 2009. He gave a TED Talk that was viewed by 1 million people. The company was just on fire, and there was nothing else like it. No one else was even close at that point. Now, of course, things have switched, and now Tesla's on top of the world, and Better Place is not. But at that point, it was the darling of the high-tech world and the electric vehicle world.
But what was Better Place? Was it just a car distribution company? Did they just bring cars in and sell them to you, or did they do something else as well?
So Better Place did not make cars. And a lot of people sometimes think that there's a car called the Better Place car, but they didn't. Better Place was an electric infrastructure company. Their idea was to provide the infrastructure for any electric car that had a switchable battery. So they were operational in Israel, they were operational in Denmark, in the Netherlands, they had outlets in China, Japan, Hawaii, Austria, Canada. They were all over the world. But they didn't make their own cars, so they contracted with Renault, the French car maker, to sort of retrofit a car that was already in the pipeline called the Fluence. It's a 5-seat sedan, not a particularly sexy car. It certainly was not a $100,000 Tesla, but it was on its way, and it was fairly easy to retrofit it. You took the gasoline tank out of the back, you put a big battery in, you took the gas engine out, you put an electric engine, and you had a car that now could run on electricity and could have a switchable battery. And Better Place wanted to have cars from many manufacturers, eventually from General Motors and BMW and Volkswagen, from all over the world. ultimately, before they went out of business, they only had Renault, that which turned out to be a problem. But the company was an infrastructure provider, and since they didn't sell cars, what did they sell? How did they make money? They sold electricity. They sold kilometers or miles in the same kind of way that a cell phone company sells minutes. So you would get your car, get a subscription, and then you would pay, in our case, 600 shekels a month, so around $150, $200 a month, and that would give you up to, I think, 1,000 kilometers a month, and you could switch batteries as much as you wanted as long as you stayed within the 1,000 kilometers, and then after that you would pay between 55 and 65 agarot per kilometer. And in that way, Better Place was going to make money like Orange and Partner and Pelephone made money, not on selling the cars.
One of the things that comes across in the book are these some extraordinary characters that were involved with this company. Apart from Shai Agassi, one of them was Idan Offer. There's a wonderful moment in the book where Idan Offer, who's the head of the Israel Corporation, he wants to read a Harvard thesis about management. And if you and I were reading a Harvard thesis about management, we might, I don't know, sit in an armchair, take it to bed, I don't know, take it to the beach. He gets on his yacht, his $10 million yacht in Monte Carlo, and by the time he gets off in Greece, he's read the thesis from Harvard, which is, that's not something you can say about many people, that they chose to read the thesis on their $10 million yacht. And you spent quite a lot of time with Idan Offer from reading the book. Tell us about some of the characters involved that were part of this story and that you came to interview.
Idan Offer was probably the most interesting character that I interviewed because I've never met or interviewed somebody whose net worth is $4.5 billion. And we met in his penthouse at 1 Rothschild, which is at the end of Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv, one of these overlooking the Mediterranean. He has his own private butler. While we were there while I was interviewing him, the doorbell rings, and in walks, and this is a few years ago, in walks Ehud Olmert. Shakes my hand, wants to get to know me, which is when I realized why he actually was elected prime minister. He's very charismatic, But so this is the kind of person that Idan Offer, hangs around with. He's very, very wealthy. He's very, very savvy. He's invested through the Israel Corporation and through his private arm called Quantum Pacific in many companies, many of which were not clean energy companies at all, like the Dead Sea Works or an oil refineries in Haifa. So when Shai Agassi came to him in 2007 with really just the idea on a piece of paper for what Better Place would be, Idan listened carefully. They had a good rapport. They went down the elevator, and you all know what an elevator pitch is. That's when you're in an elevator with a very successful person, an investor who you have 15 seconds before the doors open again to pitch them on your idea. So they're literally going down the elevator. He already had gotten to know him, and at the end of the ride, Idan Offer pulls Shai Agassi aside, puts his hand on his shoulder, and says, "I'm in for $100 million." And he was. That was the first investment in the company. From there, Idan became the chairman of the board. They raised more money from Morgan Stanley and from the Maniv Group and from HSBC. Very, very big investors. But Idan was always the main sort of voice and really the opposition to Shai. So a lot of the book plays out as kind of a war of wits between the very powerful chairman of the board and the very powerful and charismatic CEO. And they didn't always agree on everything. So what you're alluding to with the yacht story is Idan had this very expensive yacht, and near the end, or the middle of 2012, at the end of the time that Shai Agassi was the CEO, they had been fighting, and there were conflicts, and there were all kinds of questions about how much money the company was spending and whether or not Shai Agassi at this point was the right person for the job. And somebody put a copy of a magazine article called "Narcissistic CEOs: The Pros and Cons." I think it's the incredible pros, the terrible cons. It's by a Harvard University professor, Michael McCoby. And he picks it up. It's only 7 pages long, and he reads through it, and he realizes that, at least this is what he told me when I interviewed him, he realized that the description of narcissistic CEOs applied to his CEO, Shai Agassi. The goods, all the amazing things he built, but also not being willing to listen necessarily to what other people had to say, and there were a lot of different questions that came up. And at the end of that yacht ride, he said, "I can't work with him anymore." And of course, the company was already only a few weeks away from being out of money, which was obviously the real catalyst. But at that point, Idanhofer fired the CEO and founder and visionary of the company, which many in the Israeli press said, okay, this is normal. You don't have your visionary founder forever. You hire a manager who's done this before. But it didn't play well. People lost confidence. Investors lost confidence. The journalists, the newspapers, attacked Better Place, and it never recovered. It went out of business about 6 months later.
So you describe this, and I think correctly, as a kind of a thriller, as a kind of a whodunit. And we open the book. The body is already cold. We know who's dead here. And so the question is, who done it? So tell us, who done it? What went wrong with Better Place, and who was responsible?
That is a question that everybody has been asking. It may in fact be the reason why you're even in this room today, because you want to know who done it, who killed, or what killed Better Place. And the answer is everyone and no one. So let me explain what that means. People said, was it the CEO? Was it the chairman of the board? Was it the Israeli government that didn't support the company enough, although that can be debated? Was it Renault that priced the car too high and didn't support the battery switching infrastructure that Better Place wanted? There are many different questions. Was the car too expensive? Did the company raise too much money? Did the company not raise enough money? Many, many questions. And the answer is that everyone is right. Every one of those things led to the company's demise. And no one person was responsible. The CEO will tell you that the chairman of the board was the one who didn't believe in him, and the chairman will say the CEO didn't spend the money correctly. But what really happened is what I found in the course of writing the book is that it was a case of changing business assumptions. So in business, you start usually by writing a business plan, a business and marketing plan, and you have to write down what you assume things will be, how much the car will cost, how much it will cost for service, how much money you'll spend a month on staff and offices. And that's normal. You do that. But when things change, you adjust the business plan. So in Better Place's case, everything started to change. At one point, the car was promised at a low price, $10,000, but the car came in at $35,000, and customers didn't like that. At one point, it was assumed that the car could get 180 kilometers between charges, but the car got 120, maybe 140 on a good day if you're not using the air conditioning or the heat or the windshield wipers or not going up too many hills. And if you have a car that only goes 120 kilometers, but you've built the switching stations at a distance where they're maybe 140 to 160 kilometers apart, you get a problem, for example, like this. We wanted to drive to Eilat from our house here in Jerusalem. The distance between the switching station at the Dead Sea, at the top of the Dead Sea, and the southern end of the Dead Sea was 160 kilometers. We couldn't get more than 140 kilometers. We couldn't drive that way. Now, I said this once to the director of customer service at Better Place. I said, "What are you going to do about this?" And he said, "It's not such a big problem. You'll go by way of Beersheba." and that is actually one of the problems with not just Better Place, but electric cars in general, which is that people in the electric car industries are always saying, you can do okay with this. Okay, so you have to stop your car every 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers, in Tesla's case, every 400 kilometers, and charge it for 30 to 45 minutes. It's okay. you can deal with that. But that is not what consumers want. Consumers, when they're trading for a new technology, electric cars, they want it to be as good or better than the car that they had, the gasoline-powered car. They want to be able to charge it, in 5 minutes, anywhere, and be able to go 300-400 miles or kilometers, on a single charge, like they can with a tank of gas. So this put people off the car as well. And then there were other issues that changed. They thought that the switching stations would cost $500,000 to build. They cost $3 million a piece to build. They thought it would cost $100, $150 to install a charge spot in your home. But they didn't account for the fact that they would have to send, not one person, but two, and they might have to come back a second time, and there might be legal work that you have to deal with the House Committee. It wound up costing 10 times that, $1,000 per installation. And when you add all these things together, all these changes, Better Place was faced with a situation where they were actually losing money on every car they sold. And what does that mean? It means that it doesn't matter if you have more money or more time. Every car you sell, you lose more money. So at this point, the company needed to decide what to do. Either stay the course, double down on the dogma of switchable batteries and it'll work out and we'll raise more money and technology will get better, etc., or pivot. And that's a very common thing that happens in business. You say, you know what? The business plan that we started with in 2008, it doesn't work anymore, we're going to change. I think, after having spoken to a lot of people, that Better Place could have survived if it had pivoted, if it had changed, and I can talk about what that would have meant, but that's not what it did. It stayed with the business model from 2008, despite the changes in the business assumptions, and it just ran out of money. And that is the less glamorous, but still interesting in the book story.
And I mean, it wasn't $1 billion, 850 million. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money, and they spent all that in what, 4 years? I mean, how? How on earth do you spend, more than $200 million a year? Where did the money go?
Well, the part that's even more sort of shocking is in January 2012, the company had raised a Series 3 or Series C round of $200 million. And that should have lasted a long time, but at that point they were spending about $1 million a day. Okay, that's the burn rate. They were spending it on offices. They were spending it on buying the car because they had to buy the car from Renault and resell it. They had to buy the battery. Each battery cost $15,000. Now, the car was sold for $35,000 to customers, of which Better Place, at the end of the day, earned about, $3,000, which wasn't enough really to cover, the expenses. But the $15,000 battery, Better Place had to buy themselves because you, the consumer, actually bought a car with an empty slot where the battery was. You didn't own the battery. So Better Place owned the battery. They had to buy the battery. Now, $15,000 times a lot of cars that you're buying in advance that you don't know if you're going to sell, that's an expense right there. Then there's all those switch stations, $3 million times 40 switch stations that they built around the country, all the charge spots that had to be put in, all of the business development expenses, all those offices and flying to different countries and talking to different people. It really just adds up. And then, of course, it's the high-tech world in Israel, and we've long passed the days when Israeli salaries were lower or are lower than U.S. high-tech salaries. Israeli developers and high-tech professionals earn just as much as their counterparts in Silicon Valley do. And Better Place had over 1,000 people on staff, or on staff and contractors making high wages. Put it all together, and there you go. $200 million in 200 days, and they're out of money.
One of the early champions of Better Place was Shimon Peres when he was president, and he took Shai Agassi to Davos and he introduced him to people there, and he turned him into this kind of poster boy for Israeli high tech. And then the Israeli government was supposed to step in with tax breaks and help this company. But at the end of the day, as you say, the car sold for $35,000. Even today, even though the tax on an electric car in Israel today is 10%, and the tax on a normal car is 80%, electric cars are still more expensive than normal cars. Now, is that because the Israeli government didn't give the tax breaks? Is it because they gave the tax breaks but they went to Better Place, not to the consumer? Or is it just because electric cars are just too damn expensive to build?
So the problem here was a combination of what the price that Renault, the manufacturer, charged to Better Place and what the market could bear, or what the market expectation was from Renault. So let me explain. The Better Place expected that Renault would sell them the car, the wholesale price, I guess, for the car from Renault to Better Place for somewhere in the range of 70,000 shekels. And Renault looked at the situation and said, okay, how are we going to price the car? And the way that car manufacturers price cars is they look at what their investment is, how many cars they're expected to sell, what the general prices are in the market, and then they come up with a number. And Renault said, okay, we've invested X amount. Better Place has made a commitment to buy 100,000 cars, which they didn't ever get to. They sold about 900 cars in total, but that was the commitment that they made at the beginning. And Renault calculated a price that was much more than 70,000. It was, as I said, when you add in the VAT that the Israeli government adds to the price, you really came to somewhere in the range of about 120,000 shekels. So Better Place didn't actually have a choice about what they were going to sell the car for. They were already losing money just because of the subscriptions and the costs of running the company. So they were kind of stuck with this high price that came from Renault. Now, why did Renault charge that much? It was partly because they looked at the market and said, this is how many we're going to sell and this is what we spent. But it was also that they had this other car, the Renault Fluence. Okay, Better Place sold the Renault Fluence ZE for 0 emissions, but Renault also sold the Renault Fluence, which was a gasoline-powered car, and they looked nearly identical. They're almost the same, except for a little bit of a change in the lighting, and there was a power outlet in the front of the Better Place car, and there was a gasoline, place, for the nozzle in the back of the gasoline-powered car. And Renault, I think, perhaps rightly or wrongly, said, we don't want to cannibalize the sales of our gasoline-powered car that we're introducing at virtually the same time. If we price the Better Place car at 30% less, no one will buy our gasoline-powered car. And the Renault distributor in Israel didn't want that. So they took that into account as well. And put it all together, it didn't matter that Better Place had a massive tax break that the Israeli government had given them. It just wasn't enough. The price from Renault was too high.
So we're going to take some questions in a minute. So if you want to think about what you might want to ask Brian. Stepping back from this disaster, it was a disaster, right? What lessons can we actually take from this? Or is it just a tragedy and we should just forget it and move on?
There was an article that was written in Forbes that called Better Place a Greek tragedy, and it didn't go over well with the former management of Better Place calling it a Greek tragedy. But in the world of high tech, the first ones out are usually not the ones who succeed long term. Apple came out with the iPhone first, but then Android came out. Now Apple's coming back, with something to compete with Android. Now there's other ones from China. So the first one out the gate will not necessarily be the one that sells the most or be the most successful. But you need those steps along the way. You can't get to the better place, so to speak, the nice outcome, without some failures along the way. And in fact, the high-tech world is built around the expectation that companies will fail. Venture capitalists go into the business knowing that 80-90% of the companies they invest in will fail, but the remaining 10% will have some large exit, whether it's an IPO, they go public on the stock market, or they're bought that will keep the venture capitalists and all the other companies going. So, in fact, the investors in Better Place are not, they're not in a bad place right now. In fact, one of the first investors just raised $40 million for a new fund focused on autonomous driving. So he's doing okay. He didn't, love the fact that he lost many millions of dollars, but that's the way it is in the high-tech world. So one lesson that I think it's very important to learn is not to read into the Better Place story as any kind of a negative or a failure of the startup nation or of high-tech in general. Yes, it was big, and that's why we're sitting here, and that's why it seems like such a horrible tragedy, because it was a nearly $1 billion or $850 million of money that was lost, and today, there's nothing much to show for it. But that happens all the time, and it's a lesson to internalize that we should keep in mind. The second thing, is that I alluded to it before, which is that we have to keep in mind what the customer wants. Better Place was kind of what I would describe as a countrywide beta test, or a countrywide case study of what electric car consumers will accept from their cars. So, we know now that consumers don't want switchable batteries. They don't want them. They didn't go for them, and nobody else is doing them. Everybody else is doing, fast charge, even though it's, it's not, as quick as a 5-minute, switching battery. But we learned that as well, and that was important to learn as well. We also learned, or at least this is the conclusion that I came to, which is that electric cars, including Tesla and the new models from General Motors and BMW and everyone else, will not really take off until the battery technology improves so that you can drive either 1,000 kilometers or 1,000 miles on a charge, or you can charge up that 1,000-kilometer battery in 5 minutes. The Tesla, as I said several times, can take 30 to 40 minutes, and it certainly only goes 300 to 400 miles on a good day. We need better technology. It's coming. The good news is there are companies around the world, including one in Israel, which is called StoreDot, just raised $60 million from Daimler to work on its battery charging technology that can charge up a full electric car battery in 5 minutes. When we get that, and if all of the electric car companies can agree to standardize on these kind of batteries, which is a big question, then you're going to see the electric car future really happening. And that's something we also learned from the Better Place experience.
Is that ethical? Is that ethical? Usually, if you've got a high-tech widget on beta testing, it's some app on your phone, right? And it either gets you an elephant, or it doesn't get you an elephant, or it switches on your Hanukkah lights, or it doesn't switch on your Hanukkah lights. And if it fails, right, it doesn't matter. But buying a car for most people is the second biggest, well, probably the third biggest, right? You've got buying a house, you've got, getting married, and then you've got a car, right? And so it's like the third biggest expense. No, there's children as well. Anyway, whatever. So it's big. It's a big expense. And I would feel cheated. I would feel defrauded if I was asked to buy a house that then fell down, and then the house builder or designer or whatever came along and said, well, I was just trying it out. Okay? Is it ethical to beta test on such a huge scale with such huge amounts of money involved? And as you say, the investors, well, they walk on to their next investment. But I'm sure there are people out there who spent all this money on a car who probably can't afford to buy another one.
We felt that way about the car as owners of a Better Place car when the company, went out of business and we couldn't drive the car to Eilat or the Golan Heights or the Hula Valley again. Yeah, we felt pretty frustrated, which is why about 250 of us sued Renault. We couldn't sue Better Place because Better Place didn't exist. And eventually, earlier this year, Renault actually offered us a settlement, which is why we no longer have our electric car and we have a gasoline-powered car, which was very, very painful for us to switch to. But so yeah, it definitely was painful for us. But it wasn't unethical, because to be unethical, you would have had to be aware that it was going to fall apart from the beginning, that you were beta testing it and it never could succeed. And that wasn't what Better Place, management believed. They believed that it was going to transform the world, that everybody was going to switch to switchable battery cars, and they did it in completely good faith. I think near the end there were questions about how much were they sharing about the company's financial predicament, and that you could have questions about, but the ethics of it I think are okay. They weren't trying to defraud anyone. We look back at it in retrospect, in hindsight, and we think, how could they have spent so much money? But when you're in the middle of it, it seems quite normal. Kind of like when you're throwing a wedding for your kids and the prices keep going up, and they want the nice hors d'oeuvres and the fancier hall, and the price keeps going up, but you're in the middle of it, so you say, okay, we're not doing anything unethical here. And I'm looking at my kids and my machatena and everyone in the room.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions for Brian? Korea, let me bring you a microphone.
Thank you. You say you didn't do your due diligence. It seems to me from what you said after that Idan Alpha didn't do his either. And would you perhaps suspect that he wanted to get into another tax bracket?
I haven't heard that one before. There was a movie made, a television documentary made a number of years ago called The Shakshuka Effect, and it was a damning documentary against Idan Ofer and the Ofer brothers and his holdings, and so it was not flattering, and so there's a lot of people who don't love him as a character. That said, I never heard that he was trying to get into a higher tax bracket or do anything fishy. I think a lower tax bracket, right? I think what he was really trying to do was get past some of the negative press that he had, partly from the movie, partly from his holdings in oil and the Dead Sea Works, which gave him a really bad name. And by getting into clean energy, electric cars, it looked really good. It was good PR. And by the way, he wasn't the only one to do it. In Denmark, one of the investors who helped Better Place establish its network of switching stations and car sales in Denmark was a company with the unfortunate in English name of DONG, stands for Danish Oil and Energy and Gas. And they were also accused of being in all kinds of dirty energy, and they wanted to what something called greenwash their name. In fact, they wound up losing staff, and having people fired because they were accused of greenwashing through something else entirely. But Better Place contributed to that. So, if anything, I think that his motivation for not doing his due diligence was he was just so excited about the possibility of improving his reputation.
You alluded to that it might have been a pivotal change that might have saved the company, so could you elucidate on that?
Gary asked, what would be the pivotal change that I thought might have saved the company? Well, it wouldn't have made things good for us, actually, but I think when the company realized that it was not making money on cars in Israel with its infrastructure and its the pricing structure, it probably should have pulled out of Israel entirely and moved to China. Now, why China? Because they had an operation in China. It was just a visitor station and a demo center with a switchable battery car, but there was none of the sort of baggage, the financial baggage, the reputation baggage at that point that was going on in Israel. The Chinese have set goals that Israel has still not set, really, to switch their entire fleet to electric cars, within the next 20 to 30 years. They have a huge pollution problem. Anybody who's been to Beijing knows you can't go out without a gas mask or one of those white masks on because it's just so polluted. And I think that it would have been radical. It would have left us with a car that we couldn't charge. It would have been embarrassing because you would have had these 40 stations all around the country that would have been the way they are today. But the company could have potentially continued. It could have raised more money, and it would have not ended as this sad Greek tragedy, but as the plucky company that pivoted to China.
Brian, I'm curious about the board or those that were potentially responsible for looking at the numbers throughout the years. Maybe in the beginning they weren't as attentive, but as the burn rate was really increasing, nobody was aware what was going on. Nobody was checking. There was no like board meetings where they would review financials.
The one microphone curse here. I get time to think about my answer to that one. Thanks. So what happened is that at one point, about a year and a half, about 18 months before Shai Agassi was fired by Idan Ofer in September 2012, the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer of the company, resigned along with much of, well, a little bit after that, most of his finance team also resigned. And he resigned, and he told me, I interviewed him for the book, because he was very, politically correct about it, but he didn't agree with the direction the company was going, which probably meant he didn't agree with the way that the company was spending or where it was putting its emphasis. He left, and the board of directors said, okay, we need a new CFO. The CFO is the guy who looks at the big picture, monitors all the numbers. And in Better Place's case, this was very important because there were many different divisions set up. There was the Israeli division, there was the Danish division, there was Better Place Labs, which was the R&D division, which was a separate division. There was the US division. There were all these different divisions, and there was no single point of authority or a person to ask, what are we spending? No one was looking at the numbers. And a new CFO was not hired until Shai Agassi left. Now, some said that it was because he didn't want a CFO, because it would have challenged his vision on things. Other people said they simply couldn't find someone because they didn't have a high enough caliber CFO in Israel where the headquarters was. For whatever reason, there was no one looking at the numbers, except for one guy who I talk about in the book, who became like the boy who cried wolf. And he realized in February 2012 that the company would be out of money by October. And he ran around to all the board members and to the management and said, we're going to be out of money, we're going to be out of money. And everyone got alarmed, but they didn't really listen, and eventually they ignored him. And they ran out of money. In October 2012, Idan Ofer put $100 million extra into the company to keep it going because it was out of money. Now, the truth is, I haven't looked at the financials. I don't know that it was out of money completely, on October 31st, 2012. I do know that there's no reason why you would put $100 million into a company that had just lost its CEO, that wasn't selling cars and had lost the trust of the public and the media, unless you didn't have any more money.
We'll take a couple more questions.
I don't know, like a comment and a question. It sounds like the business was run by very arrogant people who didn't do any diligence. It sounds like everything that they estimated was underestimated. And you say they planned for 100,000 cars to be sold, and they sold 800. I mean, even in high tech, that's rather bizarre. But the real question I have is, there's a lot of articles written about the whole idea of electric. And there's a lot of people who feel that unless government is going to force people to buy electric, that electric really is not the solution to the future. There's a lot of concern about how you produce electricity, all the oil, all the gas, all the pollution that goes into the production of electricity. There's a lot of concern about what's going to happen to all these batteries when they go out. And there's a lot of hype about electric that seems to get swept under the carpet by people who are electric proponents. And the question is whether the old model of the gas engine can be made better.
I actually would refer you to a podcast that you can get on the internet called Science Versus, where they look at the question of could we turn, and they looked at just the United States, turn the entire United States into using just electric power, not just cars, but planes and factories and manufacturing. And their answer is Yes and no. The thing about electric, for electric cars or in general, is that it is not dependent on gas and coal and fossil fuels. There are other alternatives. There is the sun, there's hydropower, there's wind power. Now, today, right now in 2017, those will not give us enough power. The batteries won't hold the power long enough, so, in the evening when the sun is not shining and when the wind is not blowing. So there are many problems today with imagining that can convert the world to electric. But there are power sources out there that are not fossil fuels. And so if we believe that those will happen in the next 20 to 30 years, then switching the easiest part of the transportation grid, which is electric cars. Think about how hard it is to switch airplanes to electric batteries. I don't know if they would actually get off the ground. The batteries are too heavy. But cars, you can do it. We know. We see it. It works. And we know that if they're running on electric batteries and electric power, we could get other sources of power. Maybe down the road, they're not there yet. If we stick with gasoline and oil and other fossil fuels, for factories and for cars, we will never get there. We will continue to pollute the earth. We will continue to contribute to climate change. We will run out eventually of gas and oil, and that doesn't seem like a sustainable or tenable alternative.
What happened to the cars and the charging stations? Where are they now?
I am so happy you asked that question because it's after the lawsuit of the 250 of us was settled, I'd say maybe half, maybe 3/4 of us sold our cars back to Renault. We got about half of what we paid for it, which is not actually bad for a 4-year-old car. It's not, as good as it could have been, but it's not terrible. Many people who own the car were not part of the lawsuit. People who were not part of the lawsuit were invited to get the settlement from Renault too, but many kept their cars. Because they said, what, this is a great city car. I know that I can't get from Jerusalem to the airport anymore. I can't get to Modi'in anymore, but I can drive it to the supermarket and I can drive it to the central bus station to pick up my kids. I'm going to keep it for that. The battery will degrade over time, but it's a great city car, and people are keeping the cars, so you'll still find them on the road. For those,
how can they charge them?
oh, because you have a charge spot in your house. In your garage, you have your own charge spot.
But don't the batteries eventually...
And don't the batteries eventually degrade? Yes. Our battery started off with 120 to 140 kilometer range. By the time we sold it back, we wouldn't drive it more than 70 or 80 kilometers. So, by the way, Matthew asked of another lesson that we learned. We learned that in 4 years, at least that technology of battery, which is the same technology everyone else is using, will degrade about 50% in 4 years. So you need a new battery. We learned that. So the cars that were sold back to Renault were shipped off to somewhere. I don't know where. They were probably crushed. The batteries were probably buried, which that gentleman is concerned about what that means, and absolutely right to be. We don't know what the effects are of burying or burning down or recycling batteries are. The cars are gone. The switching stations are kind of like monuments to disaster. I drove out to the switch station in Jerusalem, which is ironically located right next to the cemetery, which gives the expression "gone to a better place" meaning. And it's just a shell. It's filled with garbage. The glass is broken. If you go to my website, there's a video of me actually going out there, and you'll be able to see it. In Beit Shemesh, this is perhaps the most ironic and sad but telling story of all. The switch station has been converted. It's not destroyed, but it's selling something other than cars. You know what it's selling? Tombstones. And you can see that in the Jerusalem Post. There's an actual picture of a tombstone sales lot with the Better Place sign right there. They didn't even take it down.
What happened to Shai Agassi?
Oh, it's like he's selling tombstones.
So Shai is still in Israel. He lives in the center of the country. For a while after A Better Place, he established a company in London. The idea was to sell electric-powered, battery-switchable taxis. Not to sell them, but to work with the government to power taxis in London, which is actually an idea that other companies are looking at, and it's something that worked for Better Place. They had a demo in Japan, in Tokyo, that ran for about 3 to 6 months with electric battery switchable taxis. They were doing it in Amsterdam from the airport to the city, and it was a really good idea, and I don't know why it didn't succeed. He had the company, in stealth mode for about a year. There, people I talked to confirmed that was what he was doing, but it never, there was never anything written about it. The website was just a placeholder, but for whatever reason it didn't work. And since then, he's been quiet. He speaks every once in a while at a conference about innovation, about the future of sustainable transportation, but to the best of my knowledge, he's not working on any companies anymore.
Let's take one more. Over there.
Hey, Brian. Yeah, I understand after this you're taking this back to the States. So maybe you can give us a lowdown, as long as you're here in Israel. Why was Israel the right place to do this? Or what are all the things that went wrong with Better Place because they were in Israel that might have worked different in Hawaii or Amsterdam or somewhere else?
So I'll just address the very first thing you said is, yes, we are going on the road with this, doing talks in California in November and December. So if anybody watches this video and knows someone there, have them be in touch with me, and I'd be glad to bring it to your synagogue or organization or company. The reason that they came to Israel, was really because Shai Agassi is Israeli. The company was founded in Palo Alto. The headquarters is in Silicon Valley. The company was incorporated in Delaware, like so many companies are, especially Israeli companies. And the R&D arm was in Israel. The intention was never actually to have the headquarters in Israel, but at one point, Shai felt like he wanted to be closer to the R&D and closer to his family, so he moved back with most of his senior people and moved the headquarters to Rosh Hashanah, which is where Better Place had its headquarters in Israel. So there's no particular reason why it had to be in Israel other than the Israeli connection. That said, because Better Place only signed up Renault, the French car manufacturer, which doesn't sell in the United States, it never could crack the United States. Even if Hawaii wanted to, and they had an operation in Hawaii, they had charge spots, not switching stations, but charge spots, but they worked with the Chevy Volt, which is not a switchable battery car because Renault isn't there. It didn't really fly in France because the French don't drive 5-seat sedans. They like bigger cars or smaller cars. It wasn't that popular a car in France itself. It wasn't going to fly in Germany because the Germans don't like to buy French cars. It didn't fly in Australia because Renault didn't make a car that had the steering wheel on the other side. So, at the end of the day, there were a lot of reasons why it moved to Israel and got stuck in Israel, but didn't need to be in Israel. That said, I want to say one more thing that we learned, one more lesson. This is more a lesson about Israelis than it is about high-tech in general or Better Place. And that is, we have a reputation in Israel of being the startup nation, which makes it seem like we are all risk takers and early adopters. That's what it seems like when you look at Israel. But we're not. Israelis are actually very conservative. We don't take risks. The high-tech people take risks with other people's money and then take their products to the United States or Europe. But in Israel, we're slow. Look at the bureaucracy that we have. Look at the fact that we still have to send faxes to some of the government offices. What's a fax? And we don't adopt technologies that fast. So if there was a thought that Better Place would succeed in Israel because it's a country of startup nation early adopters, that was proved wrong as well.
Okay. So in a minute, you're going to come over here and sign books for people who want them. I'm going to ask you when we finish to let Brian get to that table. Otherwise, we're going to be here all night. So please don't stop him to say hello. He'll say hello to you when you buy the book. So just one last question. What's next? You've spent 4 years on this, okay? So now you can divorce yourself a little bit from the book. You can move on to your next love. What's that going to be?
The good news is that there was no divorce in the course of these 4 years. Jodi's sitting there, and she has been incredibly supportive over this time, and it's really exciting to be here with the whole family sitting right there. Next for me, I discovered, I've been writing, 1,000-word articles for all kinds of different newspapers for a long time, for, the Jerusalem Post and Haaretz and Israel 21C and papers in the United States. And I wanted to try and write a long-form, essentially journalistic, researched piece, which I did. And based on the response of people who are here, the people who bought the book, and what I've heard, it seems to be going well. And I want to do more. So what's next for me is looking for my next book about a company or an entrepreneur, and maybe one that didn't fail this time. Matthew told me to keep the thank yous very, very short. So thank you, Matthew, for interviewing me. Thank you to the sponsors this evening, the Times of Israel, the ACI, Pico Jerusalem, and all the people who shared this on Facebook. Thank you to one of my editors who is here. Abby Leichman is here, and I've met her once before in my life. It's a delight to see you again. The people who are trying to bring the book into Chinese to sell it in China. Michael Kagan is here. He's over here. Thank you for being here and for pushing that forward. And I want to tell you just one last thing, and in case you didn't know, in addition to a book, there is a podcast version of the Better Place story that picks up from the end, from the bankruptcy, and talks about how people like us and others fell in love with the car. It was produced with Israel Story, which is a fantastic podcast. Mishi Harman is here in the audience, and it was a pleasure to work with him. It was like writing another book. So thank you to Mishi for believing me and bringing me back to the world of radio. And I already said thank you to Jodi and my kids, so I am done. I'm going to be over there. I'll be glad to sign any books. Thank you all so much for coming.